Welcome to Life Talks 2020, the virtual edition. We're in some crazy times these days with the COVID-19, but we're excited to see some of the good fruits of that. I've seen kids playing in the street more. I've been seeing posts about people looking and taking care of the elderly and the vulnerable more than probably I've ever seen. And so I'm really excited for those kinds of outcomes that we're seeing in our culture. I think it's really a cultural shift that we want to be praying into and contributing to and continuing ourselves and celebrating. So there are good things that come out of a time like this. And of course, this webinar, and lots of people are activating and starting webinars and putting their content out there. And I just think that's awesome. Let's get it to as many people as we can, right? I feel like we're still in a community here together, which is great. So thank you all for taking the time on your Friday night and tomorrow on your Saturday to join us. Very exciting. As I was saying, just a few logistics to go through. You've got a chat and you've got a Q&A option at the bottom. Feel free to look at the chat and contribute, and Tanya will be popping in with different links to things. And the Q&A is reserved for questions about the presentations that you'll hear tonight from our speakers and things that we'll use in the panel discussion tomorrow. So do feel free to send your questions in there, and we will get to them. Tonight, we are starting with two of our main speakers that we planned for Life Talks. We have, first up tonight will be Nicole Scheidl, who is the Executive Director of Physicians for Life. And we have Leah Mills, who is a human rights activist and author. They're going to be sharing their presentations with us tonight. And then tomorrow we'll be hearing from our workshop speakers and doing our panel discussion. So it's going to be a great several hours that we spend together. Before we get started, I would like to just do a quick prayer for us tonight, pray over this technology and make sure it all connects. So if you'll bow your heads with me for a moment, and I'll just say a quick prayer and commit this time to God. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this time together, and we pray that it would be fruitful and that you would place your hand over the technology, God. And I just thank you for each of the people who are here to participate in this conference with us, God. And thank you for the good things that you are doing in our world today, even in a time that seems like a crisis, Lord. So thank you for this time, and yeah, be with us tonight. So before I hand things over to Nicole, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about Halton Alive and make sure you all know who you joined in with. So we are a pro-life charity. Our focus is offering education and resources on pro-life topics. So we want to get that education out there in any way that we can, and the better equipped that you are with the knowledge and with the attitude and the grace-filled kind of approach that we teach, you will be ambassadors in your everyday life. And it's truly amazing how often life issues are coming up. You know, there's the politics of life, there's the everyday conversations, there's your neighbors, there's the water cooler discussions. And these are all opportunities. You don't even have to bring up pro-life topics yourself anymore. They're brought up for us. So how wonderful to have the opportunity to chime in with something constructive and intelligent and useful for the pro-life movement and for that person to bless them. So you'll see there, Tanya has put up our website. That's a place that you can gain resources and learn more. And we'll hope that you will continue to track with us through these times and prepare yourself. So Nicole, are you there? And do you want to put yeah, hi.
Hi, I'm here. Yeah.
We can hear you, we can see you, so that is great. Thank you so much for being here, Nicole. You are out in Ottawa, right?
That's correct. And kudos for you for pulling this together so quickly. It's really awesome.
Well, we are very excited, and we're very excited to have you here and plugged into technology. So I won't give too much of myself here. If you want to just kind of introduce yourself and go ahead, and we'll kind of monitor any questions on this end.
Sure, perfect. So I'm going to flip over to my PowerPoint and share my screen, which is more interesting than my face. So there we go. Okay, so are we good with that? Aaliyah, I can see you nodding your head. That means the screen is showing properly.
Yes, I see it, and I'll just turn myself on mute so I don't get in your way there.
Okay, perfect. No problem. I just need to, okay, here we go.
Awesome.
Okay, pardon me. So as Aaliyah said, my name's Nicole Scheidl. I'm the Executive Director of Canadian Physicians for Life. And what I'm going to speak to you about today is about conscience rights in Canada. And I've titled it Just Do What You're Told, and you'll see where that came from eventually. But first of all, I just want to give a little overview of our group. So we are a pro-life medical group. We comprise of about 4,000 doctors, residents, medical students who are very committed to Hippocratic Oath traditional medicine. We host a pro-life conference in October every year, but anyone's able to come to it, not just our members. We have medical student mentoring programs. We have a pre-med program to try and help pro-life medical or students get into medicine. We have a crisis line for physicians, residents, and medical students if they happen to be in a situation where they need help because of their conscience rights are being compromised. We have access to a lawyer for them. And we also engage with courts, government, regulatory bodies, and the media. And it was during one of those engagements that I was at a policy conference where a guy stood up and said, doctors should just do what they're told. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, really interesting perspective. And like, the question is, like, should you just do what you're told? Well, Hans Scholl was a medical student in Germany at the beginning of World War II. He served as a medic on the Eastern Front in Russia. And he was totally horrified by what he saw and became inspired by the Archbishop of Munich's strong stand against euthanasia, because that was quite rampant in the Nazi regime. And he formed the White Rose movement and started to distribute leaflets throughout Munich, calling for resistance. So he did not do what he was told. And actually, if you visit Munich today, there's streets and monuments actually all over Germany with his name on it. Another person is Nelson Mandela. He was a young lawyer in Pretoria, South Africa. He fought against apartheid. He was thrown in jail. He didn't do what he was told. He came out of prison at the age of 70, and at the age of 75, he became that country's prime minister and led it through a period of healing with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Then you have Malala Yousafzai. She was a young high school student in Pakistan. She was told to not go to school because she was a girl, but she continued to go to school and advocate for the education of women. And on October 9th, 2012, a Taliban fighter entered her school bus and shot her in the head. And she did not do what she was told, but she survived that attempt and went on to become an outspoken advocate for female education, and in fact won the Nobel Peace Prize. So certainly just doing what you're told was never been a successful defense to excuse yourself from moral wrong. In fact, during the Nuremberg trials, many of the Nazis said, we were just doing what we were told, and that wasn't accepted as a defense. So it wasn't accepted then, and it shouldn't be accepted now as a way to just do things that go against conscience. So what is your conscience? So if I ask you that question, what comes to mind? Do you see a little voice that makes you feel guilty when you lie, like Jiminy Cricket? Or do you see a devil on one shoulder and an angel on another trying to compel you to act? So sometimes we have a not a very deep or nuanced view of what conscience is, and we might find it hard to articulate. So that's one of the things that I want to give to you today, is an ability to articulate what conscience is and why you should follow it. So I want to highlight three aspects of conscience: rationality, authority, and indivisibility. So because conscience is rational, we should be able to dialogue about it. We should be able to explain why something is against our conscience. Because conscience has authority, we should expect action as people react to the authority that their conscience has over them. We expect people to follow their conscience. And because conscience has that aspect of indivisibility, We should understand that you can't ask a person to split themselves up, one type of conscience at work and another at home. We can see with Oskar Schindler that he was an example of the authoritative role of conscience. He said, "I just couldn't stand by and see people destroyed. I did what I could, what I had to do, what my conscience told me I must do. That's all there is to it." Cormac Burke, who's a philosopher, describes conscience as the guardian of personal integrity. He says it is like an alarm system that enters into spontaneous action whenever our way of acting can influence the type of person we are becoming. So if we start to act in a way that is bad for us in terms of the type of person that we're going to become, our conscience alerts us to that and tells us something's wrong here. Another way of thinking about conscience that I think is really useful, particularly in the medical context, is thinking of conscience as integrity in action. So we want people to act with integrity, and that's following their conscience. So certainly in the international arena, conscience rights are supported by a structure. And there are 3 documents in particular that speak about conscience rights. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Discrimination Based on Religion or Belief document. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out of the horrors of World War II. The inhumanity of Auschwitz and Dachau moved the world to take action. And this milestone document in the history of human rights was drafted by representatives from different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world. So it wasn't just a Western document. There were people from China, from the Arabic world, like everyone from all over the world came together to draft this document. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the declaration, or chair of the group that was drafting the declaration. But interestingly enough, John Peters Humphrey, who was a Canadian, drew up the first draft. And Article 1 reads, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience." And then Article 18 goes along to express that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So we see that there's very specific statements that conscience is an important and integral part of being a human being. Then we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So in 1982, as part of the repatriation of the Constitution from Britain, Canada adopted its own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it lists right at the very top, a fundamental freedom is the freedom of conscience and religion. And I think I just want to highlight here that there are 2 different freedoms, right? There's a freedom of conscience and there's a freedom of religion. And sometimes what happens, and we'll see that that has happened very much in our legal system, is they've conflated the 2 and they've kind of said conscience and religion are the same thing, but they're really not. They go together quite coherently, but they are 2 separate freedoms. So we come to, against that backdrop, we come to this collision of conscience and medicine happening right now around the issue of euthanasia. And so it started on February 5th, 2015, when the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the prohibition against physicians assisting in the suicide of another human being. And so just as an aside, I was at a conference recently, just before all the conferences got canceled in this country. I was at a legal conference, and one of the judges who was on this case, he was on the Supreme Court in the Rodriguez case when the Supreme Court said euthanasia is not acceptable. And then he was on the case with the Carter case when they said euthanasia is acceptable. And someone got up and asked him what changed, like how do you justify changing, having a different decision? And he said, well, the facts changed, so therefore the law changed. It was like totally self-serving, that they wanted to make euthanasia legal, and so they just found a way. So in any ways, back to the presentation. So the criminal code was amended in 2016 to remove the prohibition for physicians and nurse practitioners to provide medical assistance in dying. But the criminal code, when it made those exemptions, also said that nothing in this section compels an individual to provide or assist in providing medical assistance in dying. the problem with this is that everyone in this country ignores that provision of the criminal code. And there's no bigger offender at the time and recently than the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario passed two policies. One that says physicians must make an effective referral for euthanasia, and they must perform euthanasia or abortion if there's imminent harm. So in the medical context, it's important to understand that a referral is part of the treatment process. So when you refer a patient, you're saying this service or this is very good and it's part of your treatment plan, and I'm going to get it for you, and I agree that you should get it this, and I'm going to make sure it happens. And so that's kind of how the referral process happens in medicine. And so what the CPSO was saying is that you must refer. And so what happened was CPL, our organization, along with the Christian Medical and Dental Society, the Federation of Catholic Physicians, and 5 individual doctors argued that this policy was constitutional or unconstitutional, and it violated our rights of conscience and freedom of religion. And even though the court found that it was a violation of physicians' rights, they allowed it anyways. And so we lost at the divisional court, and unfortunately we lost at the Ontario Court of Appeal. And what the policy really did was it compelled physicians to do what they believe is wrong and punishes them if they refuse. So just think about that for a moment and the moral distress that it causes to a physician. You're forced to do something you believe to be wrong, which is kill another human being. And really what's happening is you're breaking something within you, your conscience, that is indivisible with who you are. And so it really forces a break in the physician. And the problem is highlighted here because those with a utilitarian mindset don't see conscience. They don't see conscience. They just see it like it's a preference. Like you prefer pepperoni pizza. It's like no big deal. Whereas someone who takes conscience seriously recognizes how serious this is. There were also a number of intervenors at the Court of Appeal. And so they had some really interesting arguments, which I think are worth thinking about. What they said was that forcing someone to participate in a perceived wrongdoing reduces that person to the status of a tool to be used by others. And it really assaults the human dignity of the physician. And what if, in fact, it does is it turns them into a vending machine, right? That you get to choose as the patient what you want, and therefore, and the doctor just has to give it to you, just like a vending machine. There's no dialogue, there's no professional relationship. So it really strips the medical profession of its professionalism and turns them into mere technicians. And this poison is seeping through the medical profession to the detriment of us all. But back to this case, because I just want to focus a little bit on some of the other interveners that had interesting things to say to help you see the lay of the land now. So the OMA, which is the Ontario Medical Association, it's kind of like the union for the doctors, also intervened at the Court of Appeal and asked for the court to provide guidance on the freedom of conscience in a secular sense. Because what had happened at the lower level court was the freedom of conscience and freedom of religion had gotten all tangled up, and the court was only looking at freedom of religion. They weren't talking about freedom of conscience. And so the OMA came in and tried to get some more clarity around that and try and ask the court to actually speak to freedom of conscience. The court didn't, and we lost at the Court of Appeal. So going on at the same time, you have the Canadian Council of Academies, who were asked to look at the possible expansion of euthanasia through advanced directives for mature minors, so the killing of children, euthanasia for the mentally ill, so killing those who are suicidal, and also advanced directives, so you can decide at an advanced date that you want to die. But surprisingly to me anyways, the Council of Academies didn't come out with any recommendations. They just said to the government, here's the problems, and here's here's the concerns, and here's the problems, and this is what it might look like moving forward, but these are issues you'll have to deal with. But the interesting thing from a conscience perspective was buried deep within one of those reports, and it said in the advanced directives report that it would be valuable to support those who consciously conscientiously object to may because those who value moral integrity won't enter medicine. Now think about that for a moment. Those who value moral integrity won't enter medicine. So I don't know about you, but I want my doctor to value moral integrity. And the other reason that they thought supporting conscientious objection would be important was that it would maintain diversity in the healthcare system. So I think one of the problems that we've come into, and that's certainly how the courts have characterized the relationship between the doctor and the patient, was one of being adversaries. Like the patient wants something that the doctor won't give because of conscience, and so they are adversaries. And really that's a false dichotomy. What they should look like is this, the value of mutuality, that the doctor and patient are a team that are working together. And so what happens is, in this kind of framework, patients receive respect for their autonomy from physicians, which includes the freedom to refuse treatment. And we all think we should have that we should not have to take treatment we don't want. But physicians also then receive respect for their integrity, including the freedom to refuse to participate in a service where there are serious grounds for moral objection. So that there's like mutual respect, and that the patient then can get what they want if they want to access a treatment in another way, not forcing the doctor to be complicit. This also, it protects the integrity of both the patient and the doctor and allows for diversity in medicine. So with a diversity in viewpoint, it allows patients to find the right fit for themselves and allows for a more honest discussion and dialogue to go on between the patient and the physician. With physicians and within their governing bodies, that should lead to collegial respect. But we're finding that doesn't happen in the current climate. So there's been a movement towards arguing for conscience legislation. So Manitoba is the only province in Canada that has conscience legislation. We've been working with many other provinces. You may have recalled that in Alberta, there was an attempt to bring in conscience legislation in the fall that failed. The bill ended up dying on the order paper, but Manitoba has successfully done that, and we're trying to work with other provinces, because health is a provincial matter, to legislate conscience protection for healthcare workers. There was an attempt at the federal level with a private members bill by David Anderson that also did not, I mean, he was in opposition, so obviously it didn't go forward. And it's more challenging at the federal level because there's not really the right fit in terms of balance of or division of powers for that type of bill to have an effect. But I just want to take you back to something that happened in the 1940s. So the New England Journal of Medicine in 1949 published an article looking at medical science in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. And their conclusion was that whatever proportions these crimes finally assumed, it became evident to all who investigated them that they had started from small beginnings. The beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitude of physicians. It started with the acceptance of the attitude, basic in the euthanasia movement, that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in its early stages concerned itself merely with the severely and chronically sick. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included in this category was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, so the disabled, the ideologically unwanted, so people who didn't agree with you, the racially unwanted, and finally all non-Germans. And the danger for us is that euthanasia poisoned the medical profession in Germany, and doctors became a tool of the state. And the danger is that could happen here, especially when there's pressure to reduce costs, when there's pressure to make sure there's enough organs for organ donation, there's pressure within the system to euthanize people or to encourage euthanasia as the most appropriate medical treatment. And now we come to today. And so we have the COVID crisis. And, I'm mixed up here. So I wanted to tell you about a woman. She was in BC. She had pneumonia. She was in the hospital for 4 days under observation because they were doing the COVID test to see if she had COVID. In fact, she did not have the coronavirus. But the medical staff who most regularly visited her during that time were the ones that wanted to make sure, you sure you don't want euthanasia? Are you sure you don't want euthanasia? Several times, like not just once, and she said no. They came at her many, many times because they didn't understand that a 91-year-old woman might still want to live, and that she was taking treatment and it was costing the system, and that was unfair. And that was what was expressed to her. So eventually they discharged her because she had treatable pneumonia, but they didn't give her any treatment plan for her pneumonia. They just sent her home to be with her husband and her son. And you can see that this kind of intolerance is just poisoning our system. It's intolerance towards the elderly, intolerance towards the sick, intolerance towards the disabled, intolerance towards colleagues who are opposed to euthanasia. It's seeping through the system, and it's having consequences that were not intended when people initially thought, oh yeah, if people want, if they're suffering at the end of their life, doctors should be able to relieve them of their suffering. That's the way euthanasia was sold. But the way it's coming to fruition in real life is not like that at all. And so I want to leave you with a final thought about why conscience protection is so important. To me, conscience protection is like the canary in the mine. Sorry, mine, not mind, the mine, M-I-N-E. When it dies, it's no longer safe for humans. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole, so much. Folks, if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A. A couple of things that I kind of thought of as I was listening to you talk. One question is, have you guys seen like an exodus of physicians due to due to euthanasia and the new rules?
Absolutely. We've seen physicians leave Ontario because Ontario was the most challenging jurisdiction to be in. And so it was an outlier, like no one else in the world, much like no one else in Canada, no one else in the world required doctors to refer. Even the Netherlands, where euthanasia was like, they've had it for a very long time, they protect conscientious objectors. Doctors don't need to refer, but Ontario decided that they needed to take that step. And so doctors were leaving Ontario. I also know doctors who've gone to the States. They just left Canada altogether. I've met medical students who are training overseas, and they're Canadian students, but they went overseas for medicine, and they're looking back, do I want to come back home? Not with this regime. I'm going to go to the States. I'm going to go somewhere else where my conscience is respected.
Wow. Yeah, so really we're really pushing the envelope here in Canada to sort of be the most liberal in terms of this type of euthanasia law.
Yes, yeah.
Wow. And so a second question that kind of connects to that, then you gave that example of the woman who was sort of really sloughed aside because it's like, oh, you're old, so don't worry about it. What can we do about that kind of pressure on the elderly, whether we're elderly or whether we're family members of elderly and vulnerable populations?
I think you have to assume that when you go to the hospital, you can't go alone. You need an advocate, and you need an advocate who stays with you all the time. I had a friend, she is 27 years old, university educated, but in a wheelchair. She has cerebral palsy, but she's a policy analyst. She works full time. She lives on her own. She got a cold over Christmas 2 years ago, and it got really bad. She had no friends around, so she went by herself to the hospital, and the doctor treating her said, you're having trouble breathing. Are you sure you don't want oxygen? Because, we don't have to treat you. Do you really want, like they asked her several times.
Right.
So the suggestion was like, you're really not, like, if you want to end it all now, we're good with this. We can just like let you go. Even though it was just like pneumonia, again, like simple, treatable, give her penicillin, send her on her way, and she'll be fine.
Right. So the undercurrent of that ultimately is even though they're not maybe saying it, they don't really value her life with the suggestion that, hey, maybe you should just end it all, like, because how could you possibly have anything worth living for if you have cerebral palsy, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a very ableist view, like, I can't see myself living like you, so therefore you must feel miserable in your life.
Right. So do you see any kind of idea around maybe trying to, for healthcare workers to kind of humanize people a little bit? Like I can see how maybe you get into the healthcare industry, you deal with so many people every day and you kind of put up walls.
Yeah.
Is there any movement, say, to sort of humanize more vulnerable populations to healthcare workers so that they don't have that kind of attitude?
I think that, I mean, that's one of the things that we do, is try to really educate our medical students and residents on how to talk to both their colleagues and to people, so that they don't have that attitude. Mm-hmm. At the end of our conference, we typically bring in someone from a patient perspective to speak to physicians. 2 years ago in Calgary, we had a young man who has trisomy 18 come in and speak to the doctors or to the medical students, and it really blew away the medical students, because that just the week before they had a class that trisomy 18 was not compatible with life. Any baby that was diagnosed with that should be aborted. They shouldn't be given birth to, et cetera, et cetera. And here's an 18-year-old young man speaking and giving a fabulous PowerPoint presentation. So they were just totally blown away. And what they did was they actually had him come into their medical school. They've had him come in for 2 years now to speak to the medical students. And they have said, the medical students have said, you have changed my practice. You have changed the way I look at people with disabilities. Like, thank you so much. And I think we have to do more of that, is to take doctors or medical students in particular out of their isolated little, I guess, petri dish of how they're getting educated, and give them more, more chance to interact with people with different backgrounds and disabilities and challenges, and let them see that they're human.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps a bit of a call to people who are in a position to share their story that way, to see how they can get involved even.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Are you seeing a similar response to things in other areas, like beyond the area of euthanasia? I mean, obviously abortion is probably one of those areas, and we're seeing things about like therapeutic assistance for people dealing with like transgender issues and that sort of thing. Are you seeing this sort of replicated in multiple areas now?
Yes, yeah, it certainly seeps through everything. That attitude is very prevalent. What you're seeing with abortion or children, like, what you're seeing actually is there's no ability or desire to get to the bottom of what the issues are. Right. So when a woman comes in and says, I want an abortion, there's no like, why do you feel like this? Are you getting pressured? It's just like, yeah, here you go. Same with euthanasia. Is there elder abuse going on? Why do you feel like you need to die now? What's happening? There's no digging behind it. I had a physician who had a young man come in that wanted to transition, and he said, okay, I'm going to send you to a psychiatrist. Let's talk it through, like get to the bottom of it. The psychiatrist didn't talk it through, didn't get to the bottom of it, just sent him for gender reassignment surgery immediately. Right. And so to me, that's a failure of a doctor to do what he or she should be doing for the best of their patients.
Right. So that goes back to your point of doctors and healthcare just as vending machines.
Yeah.
I think is a great sort of imagery for that.
Yeah, well, when they think about themselves like that, it totally removes their the necessity of them to make an assessment. They just give whatever the patient wants.
Right, right, which ultimately is not going to result in good healthcare.
No.
No. I have another question here. It says, how important is it to have a power of attorney, for personal care, and should it be in place for people of all ages?
Yes, I think it's super important. I would say that it used to be the situation where doctors would more often, like they would just listen to family members and just take it from there. Now there's a lot more pushback, and I think it behooves you, it's well worthwhile to have a personal care power of attorney. I would say that the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, Alex Schattenberg has created a very nice power of attorney for personal care that people should certainly take a look at and see if that suits them. They can get it, purchase it from him. I think that helps support their organization. And then you could even take it to your own lawyer and say, I want something along these lines.
Awesome. Okay, we'll see if Tanya can grab that URL and post it in the chat. That's another great resource. Otherwise, we'll follow up with that as well. Here's an interesting question. How do you know if your doctor is pro-life? I guess I know I've gotten that question many times before, people saying, hey, how can I find a pro-life doctor? I want someone, and I know that there's no list, and there's, I've probably sent you emails actually about this before.
Yeah.
You know, and there's good reasons not to have lists, like it would turn into a blacklist, right? So
yes,
you want to be cautious, but how can people, I mean, myself, I find myself looking for a personal doctor myself, and it's like, how do you find someone with the same values without like touring all the doctors?
You know what, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's also an opportunity to educate your doctor and bring him along. I don't know if you ever saw the video of, now I can't remember the doctor's name right now. He was the doctor in Unplanned. He was the abortion doctor, Dr. Anthony.
Oh yes. Oh
yeah. Anyways, he tells the story very much of a pro-life patient who came to him once a year for a checkup and said every year, you know, Dr. Laventino, thank you, Tanya, said every year, you know, God doesn't have this in mind for you. You are better than this, right? Like every year, not in an aggressive way, but just in a really inviting way, and made him cookies and dropped them off in his desk. And I don't think you should underestimate the effect you can have on your physician by saying, you know, these are really important to me, being pro-life and talking to them and engaging with them on it. And if they say, no, I'm for euthanasia, like challenging them on that. You have so much education now here. Halton Alive's giving you all this great education. Go out and educate your physicians.
Yeah.
Call them to account. Make not necessarily in an aggressive way, but get the other side, get them thinking. A lot of them are just accepting what's being fed to them and not thinking about it. And I think you can change hearts and minds that way. And I think we need to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a great response to that, actually. Just start teaching our doctors. We can share something with them as well, for sure.
Yeah.
I have a question here. Maybe you can first tell us if you can, but can you comment on Bill C7?
Yeah, okay, Bill C7. Whew. Bill C7 is the, oh my goodness, it's the new changes to the euthanasia law because of the court case Truchon and Gladue in Quebec, where the lower court said the reasonable foreseeability clause with death was unconstitutional, and the government refused to appeal it, and it was during the election campaign, so the appeal ran out, so they were stuck with the decision. They decided to stick themselves with it, and then they revised the law and put it out there, and it goes way further than the case even required them to do. So what it does is, there used to be a 10-day waiting period that when you requested euthanasia, you had a kind of a 10-day reflecting period before they were supposed to euthanize you. That's gone. So now you could go to the hospital and say, I'm really depressed. They could diagnose you, assess, diagnose, and euthanize you all in one day, right? And we know from people in palliative care that people will say, I want to die. And then once they get their pain under control, then they're good. And so, 30 to 40% of people are withdrawing their request for euthanasia. But if you don't have this 10-day waiting period, that's gone. It also has the possibility of being euthanized. It used to have two witnesses to your request, and they couldn't be related to you, right? Because if I come in and say, oh yeah, my mom, she really wants to be euthanized, and come on, mom, this is really good. You're such a burden on me, and I'll sign off and witness it. Like, that's just ripe for elder abuse. Now they've changed that. You just need one signature, and that witness can be one of your caregivers, right? So it's no longer has to be completely removed from you, and make sure that it's you're not being coerced. So that's a big problem. And then the other problem is that there's a, if you want to die and you're not dying, but you want to be euthanized, there's a 90-day waiting period, but there's no mechanism to make sure you follow the 90 days. So there's no oversight at all. So anyone really, at this point, anyone can die for any reason, and there's nothing to kind of slow it down. The other thing that's really interesting is you can do advanced directives under this. So you can say, I want to be euthanized. And then if I'm unconscious and I've handwritten it out, like there's some documentation, then you have to euthanize me. But if I've lost the opportunity to speak and I'm trying to tell you no by pushing you away, there's an exemption in the law that says the doctor can say it's just resistance to touch and euthanize you anyways. So that ability to say no and to change your mind is being taken away. And so once you get on the euthanasia train, it's very, very hard to get off.
Wow. Okay. Just looking at a couple other questions here. Would you say that the majority of medical professionals in Canada have come to accept euthanasia or even support it, if not willing to do the act themselves?
I would say that because patient autonomy is very strongly pushed in medical school, that the majority of doctors feel it's the patient's choice.
Right.
You have very few doctors who want to do it. This is the problem, is I have many friends who are working in hospitals, and the person who's doing euthanasia is coming around saying, we need more people, will you please, like, just kind of beating the bushes, trying to get doctors to do it. So there's lots of doctors who don't want to do it, but there's also a lot of doctors who've done it and can't stomach it and stop, because it is very, very shattering to actually kill somebody.
Right. That makes sense. So interestingly, we might see fewer and fewer. I mean, as people participate in that, they might say no and move away from it.
Right. What you're getting, I think, now is you're getting a few doctors who that's what they do. Right. You have Dr. LL.B out in Vancouver, and she goes around to people's houses. Like, she goes around and just, that's what she does all day.
Right. So they start to specialize in that, or much like, we have abortionists now, and that's like almost.
That's all they do. Yeah. Yeah. It's simple medicine. It doesn't take a lot to be able to stick a needle in somebody and kill them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, question here. Do you think Canada's push for euthanasia is in part because we have a public healthcare system? Since the care is paid using tax dollars, are healthcare workers starting to make decisions based on benefit to the taxpayer instead of the care of the patient first?
I absolutely think that having a system where there's kind of pressure from on top and everyone has to walk to the same beat is pushing this agenda for sure, because they want everyone to fall in line. So interestingly enough, over in Ireland, where they had, they just brought abortion, and I was at a conference with one of the top obstetrician gynecologists in Ireland, and he said, I'm the only OB that stood up and said no. And then he said, but I'm not afraid, because they have a private public system. And he said, in the private system, I'm bringing $1 million into my hospital every year with my work, and there's no way they're going to fire me. And if they fire me, they're going to have to pay me a $3 million severance package. So he has more leverage than you have over here. Over here, there's like the the hospital in Oshawa, if you will not agree to refer for euthanasia, you won't get privileges, right? So they really control where doctors can work, and even if they can work. And so that's why doctors are so afraid, because it's not that they can just go somewhere else. It's just, it's like they wouldn't be able to work at all. And that's where the fear is. And that's how they're really making them toe the line.
And would you say that then in connection to that, that's also happening a lot at the level of even screening out students who want to become doctors, where they have to sort of affirm their willingness to participate in abortion and euthanasia before even just to get in?
I think that is, it depends on the medical school. Some medical schools are doing that and some aren't. And some medical schools are very specifically saying, because they have a panel saying to some members, you can't ask that question. That's not a fair question. We try and teach our students on how to answer it, because you can, I mean, if a woman comes to you and she's pregnant and she's distressed and she wants an abortion, that's a challenging situation that you have to deal with compassion and then ask good questions. And you can say as a medical student, that's a really challenging situation. And so there's ways to talk through that shows that you're thinking about it without necessarily saying, there's no way I would never do that.
Right, okay. So that's good. So then part of what Physicians for Life does is to help educate those students in how to answer in those kind of interviews as well.
Correct, yes, yeah.
And is how large is Physicians for Life? We have someone asking how many physicians are part of it.
So we have about 4,000 members across the country.
Wow, awesome. That's great. And is there anything that like people like us can do to support the Physicians for Life? You know, I'm sure it's hard being a doctor in these days where there's sort of this assault on life, and they're kind of standing out in the crowd. Is there anything we can do for them to encourage them or support them in some way?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, there's just supporting your own doctor and telling them that these things are important and that you care about them is great. We have associate members, so people who are not physicians can become associate members of our organization. And as an associate member, you can have access to a lot of the resources that we put together. So we have resources on abortion, conscience, euthanasia. So Stephanie Gray, for example, who many of you probably know, has done many talks for us and provided resources. So we have that on our learning platform, which you could have access to as an associate member.
Okay, and are there any requirements for associate members, or do they just kind of connect with the organization?
Well, you have to fill out the form and you have to agree that you are basically pro-life. There's a series of statement of principles that we have, and you have to agree with our statement of principles.
Awesome. Cool.
So I would think most of the people on this call would be totally in tune with that.
Yeah. Yes. You're going to get an influx of associate member applications.
No, that's great. And that's good, because that also helps us when we go to the government. We can say, look, we have these many members and they're really concerned about this, and this is why, right? So it's great. Okay. Yeah. And we also support nurses and midwives and pharmacists. So we have little subgroups as well within our organization to support them.
Awesome. That is great. And midwives certainly being another area that is changing, as we have some midwives associations like supporting the concept of abortion. I don't know, potentially helping to provide them. I'm not sure. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty shocking, because that's not where midwives came from.
No, quite the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe one final question, I think here. Someone's asking, how does all this relate to kids? Like, does it happen, she says, does it happen where parents disagree with doctors or each other regarding whether or not to keep a child alive? And will it, where will it head if kids are allowed to be euthanized? So, I mean, are they going to get to start making that decision for themselves? And like, where are we headed?
That's what Toronto Sick Kids thinks. When they were preparing their policy for euthanization of, so they have some children who are like adults because they're 18, but they're still at sick kids. So they allow them to be euthanized. And then they were preparing their policy for mature minors, which included not informing parents.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So, sorry, you're saying that this is in process right now?
They have the policy in place. They're just waiting for the government to legalize it.
Wow. Okay. So we could see, I mean, much like a minor can access abortion and parents don't need to consent, they could have themselves killed and parents don't even know.
Right. That's correct.
Wow. Okay. That is, that's shocking.
I mean, that's one of the problems with euthanasia is it pretends that the person is totally autonomous with no relationships and no connections, but we know that that action reverberates throughout the family, throughout society, and that's a real problem.
Okay, well, sorry folks that my screen is getting a little dark here. I have, it's getting dark outside, but thank you so much, Nicole. Wow, you've answered many questions and given us a lot to think about. So thank you for taking this time today. I wish I could have everyone give you a round of applause. We're doing it.
It's okay, great. You know what? I'm super happy that this could go forward and really happy to be here tonight.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking this time. And I hope that we can catch up and do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe next time in person would be great.
Yes, yes. Well, we will be having a Life Talks conference again next year, the same weekend. I believe it's the 26th and 27th. So maybe we can have you come then.
Okay, great.
Great. Thanks, Nicole.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Awesome. So there you go. Yes, I'm seeing all the thank you, Nicole, Dr. Nicole's pouring in. Thank you very much, everyone. That was a great session. I am going to work on my lighting here in my living room as soon as I can. In the meantime, though, I'm going to ask Leah to start to get herself set up, but I have an exciting giveaway for us. So in preparation for Life Talks, we decided to bring to you these lovely Choose Life mugs. Unfortunately, you can't buy them at our merch table, but we will get them available online on our website. In the meantime, though, I want to do a giveaway and we will ship you one of these lovely morning mugs. So what I've done is I've accessed, the internet's great, I've accessed a random.org where we can generate a random number. So here we go, drum roll, generating. And the results are number 84. So my list of attendees tonight, I'm gonna look for number 84 here. And it's Benedict McCreesh. So Benedict McCreesh, if you made it online tonight, if you're around, we would love to give you this lovely mug. Send it your way. Please, please contact us. And if that was a no-go, we'll try another, we'll try drawing. Not everyone who registered is necessarily here right now, but maybe they're coming tomorrow and that sort of thing. So awesome. Leah, are you present with us? Yes, hi Leah. So welcome.
Thank you.
Leah is an awesome gal. Leah, are you planning to tell us how you got into all this, or will I be giving it away if I mention your...
I'll explain a little bit, but if you want to go ahead and share, you can. If not, I'll hit all the exciting bits.
I will let Leah tell you because I'm sure she's better at telling the story herself. But I got the chance to run into Leah Mills at the March for Life in Toronto last year that a few organizations put on, including We Need a Law, who's with us and helping us host this webinar tonight. Thank you, We Need a Law. And so ran into this woman and was like, hey, I know you. Didn't actually know you. But here you are. So, and actually got to hear you speak at the London Right to Life conference before, or their gala before. So great to have you with us. Thank you so much for making yourself available to do this in a new web format. And you can see Tanya has posted leahmills.ca there. So if you want to learn a bit more about her, you can do that there. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to you, Leah, to just tell us about yourself and your presentation, and we'll do a similar Q&A like we did with Nicole.
Awesome. Okay, so full disclosure, I'm a university student. I also study law, and I feel like I'm verbose by nature. And so if it's getting lengthy, just like give me the end it now sign, and I'll cut it short. And so I am Leah Mills. Thanks, Aaliyah, for the introduction. I'm super excited to be here with you guys tonight. I'm really happy that we were able to make it work out. So a big thank you to everyone who helped contribute to that. I know We Need a Law. Tabitha, I'm not sure if she can hear me, but I know she helped explain all the tech, and Aaliyah, thank you for all of your work too. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Leah. I'm 23 years old. My undergraduate degree, this is important, it is applicable to my subject. My undergrad degree was in poli-sci and women's studies. So I basically have a degree in feminism, and I currently study law at the University of Ottawa, which is where I live and where I'm kind of in quasi-quarantine right now. So I will start my presentation more momentarily, but first I want to explain a little bit about how I got involved, because I think that my story is one that is encouraging. That sounds kind of arrogant to say, but it's encouraging insofar as it helps us understand that really anyone can be involved in the pro-life movement. You don't need to have a fancy PhD. You don't need to have completed university or gone to university. You can be used at any stage. And I really think that's important for us to understand and hear clearly, because so many times we kind of disqualify ourselves and think that, we have to wait until we have our degree or we have our family set up, or maybe we've experienced a pregnancy. We kind of wait before we weigh in on issues like abortion, which is the one that I'll be talking about. And so we wait and think that we need to be qualified, but really we just need to be willing. And if you're willing, then you will be useful and you will be used to make a difference and see a culture of life ushered into Canada. And so I want to encourage you with that. And so my story, I got involved with this issue way back when I was young and spry, and I was 12 years old at the time. And so for those of you who are maybe chuckling at my comment, this is honestly almost half my lifetime. Okay, so it's almost 50% of my life that I've been doing this. And so when I was 12, I was in a public school in Toronto, and we were asked to write a speech about any topic we wanted for English class. And there were two pieces of information you need to know. First of all, I'm notorious at having a difficult time making decisions. And so when a teacher says you can write about any speech topic, it's just a lot of choices. And so I'm notorious in my family for struggling with decision making. I take a long time to order food at restaurants. So there's that, but I'm also hyper competitive. I get you to put up your hands, but I can't see you guys. So those of you who are competitive, I feel you. And so I'm hyper competitive. I'm working on it. I like to say that I'm a recovering competitive individual. And so I decided that I wanted to win this speech competition, which was attached to the speech project. And being someone who was raised in a Christian family, who's raised to believe that God knows everything and knows the past, the present, and the future, I thought, okay, well, if God knows everything, then he knows what topic is going to be the topic that the speech that wins the competition is going to be written about. You know what I'm saying? You track with me? So my shrewd 12-year-old brain deduced that the wisest thing to do would be to ask God what topic I should write about. And I didn't ask him for the winning topic because I didn't want to sound arrogant, but I was like, God, you know where my heart is at. Come on, help me out here. And so I prayed and I said, hey, God, what topic should I write about? And he suggested the topic of abortion. Now, I was not raised in an actively pro-life family. I had not heard the word abortion before. I had gone to one prayer event, but wasn't really aware of what we were praying. I just knew that I was going with my family, and so we went and prayed. And so I was not familiar with the issue. And so when I was then presented by God with the subject of abortion, I very naively said, sure, that sounds great. And I started doing research. And that's when I found out what abortion is, what it does to an unborn child, what it does to women, what it does to family, where our laws are in Canada. And for those who don't know, I suspect all of you do, but for those who don't know, we have no laws regulating abortion. We're the only democratic nation. I want to say we're the only country, although we're never really sure where North Korea stands on these issues. But we're the only democratic nation that has no laws regulating abortion. And so finding this out at the age of 12, finding out that, you know, there are approximately 100,000 abortions that happen in Canada every year, I was shocked. And so I went to my teacher and I said, I need to write about this issue. And she said I'd be disqualified if I wrote about it. She said it was too big, too mature, way too controversial, and I couldn't write about it. And so my whole school community, the librarian, my teacher, they all tried to kind of change my mind and get me to write about something else. But I'm the kind of person, I was that kid who always insisted on things not being fair and insisted that things needed to be just. And I'd say those words frequently. I think my parents could attest to that fact, you know, that's not fair. And so I was really big on justice from a young age. And so I just could not let go of this new information that I'd got about the issue of abortion. And from the perspective of a 12-year-old, abortion is pretty simple as an issue. We don't complicate it, I think, the way that adults sometimes do, and there's space for that. There's space for having nuance and recognizing really difficult situations. But as a 12-year-old, I understood that there was a baby, the baby was being killed, and that killing babies was wrong. And that was kind of all I needed to know that abortion was wrong. And so I stuck to it and said, you know, even if I'm disqualified from the competition, that's fine. I'm going to write about this issue. And so skip ahead a few weeks, I write about this issue, and I do it in front of my class. My teacher actually became hugely supportive and put me back in the competition, but it was this constant struggle. It's the Toronto District School Board. They're very pro-choice as an organization, and so they were not pleased that there was a pro-life speech kind of going through the ranks. And so I was unofficially disqualified at the final stage of the competition. But while all this was happening, my parents, who initially had really opposed me writing about this, but later saw how much it mattered to me and decided to support me, they thought I was super cute, which I was. And so they decided to take a video and post it on YouTube just to show a few friends. And my dad was the one who would constantly see the views go up, and I'd come home from school and he'd say, Leah, there are 7 views. I was like, okay, Dad, 7, great. And then we got to 25, and I was like, okay, that's pretty good. And then we got to 100, and I thought I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I was like, man, I should start signing autographs after church. Like, I'm 100 people, it's a lot. And then 100 turned into 1,000, which turned into 10,000. And 100,000. And it was at about that point we kind of were like, who on earth is watching this video? Because for those who are familiar with YouTube, which I kind of presume is everyone at this point, you know the kinds of videos that go viral on YouTube, right? They're like farting cat videos or laughing baby videos, right? These kinds of things, not sassy 12-year-olds talking about the issue of abortion. But to this day, there are approximately, I want to say 3 million people now who've seen that video on YouTube. And what that really started was this whole journey that I've been on for the last 11 and a half years almost. And yeah, and so it's been wild. I want to say it's been rewarding, and I can't really imagine my life without pro-life activism at this point in time. Back when everything started going viral, we started getting a lot of comments on the videos, and we got a lot of positive comments, a lot of people saying, you know, it's so great that you're talking about something you're passionate about. That's good. Even if they didn't agree with me, they thought it was good to see young people involved. And then there were the not so nice comments, the people who were saying, you know, we're going to find you and kill you. You should have been aborted. You should be raped specifically by your father, that kind of thing. And so my parents freaked out, understandably. I was 12 and they wanted to protect me. But we really believed, after talking about it as a family, we really believed that there was something that was happening with this video that was beyond us and beyond our understanding. And so we left it up there. But I do go by a fake name. So Leah Mills is not actually my real name. kind of there's the surprise. I apologize. Leah's like a nickname that I go by, but Mills is not my real last name. So I go by this name just to protect my family, which is kind of wild that you'd have to do that, you know, at the age of 12 in Canada. But such is the cost sometimes of activism. But over the last 11 years, I've been invited to speak internationally. I've been invited to share in schools and churches, at pro-life gatherings. I've spoken at universities. I've spoken to friendly crowds, not so friendly crowds. I've written a book about my experiences. It's called An Inconvenient Life, kind of a play on my accidental introduction into the pro-life movement, but also this idea of convenience and the ways that informs so much of the abortion debate. So if you want more information, some of the details on my story and some of the ways that I approach standard questions that you'll face if you're involved in the abortion debate, questions like, you know, what if a woman conceives in sexual assault? What if a woman's life is in danger? That kind of thing. I answer all of that and kind of include some of the content that I'll talk about in my book. So you're free to go check that out if you like. So yeah, I've been doing this for the last 11 years and I've learned a lot. And so hopefully what I can do for you today is kind of condense a lot of what I've learned and give you guys some strategies and some encouragement, some strategies that will help you as you engage with this issue, because it's a hard issue to talk about. So let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, I'm gonna presume that unless everything explodes with no's, we're gonna presume yes. Okay, let me see. I can see the chat.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, great. Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna offer some pro-life strategies for responding to pro-abortion feminists. And I'm kind of passionate about this because my undergrad was in women's studies. I've spent a lot of time with feminists. And I considered myself a feminist before I went to university, and then I went to university. And then I thought, I'm not sure if I agree with a lot of what is being shared. But it really gave me the opportunity to understand how those who support abortion or just don't understand a pro-life worldview, how they think and how they reason, and I'm now able to kind of speak their language, and so I've become very passionate about pro-lifers speaking the language of our colleagues, those who don't agree with us, but are still human beings that we want to have rational conversations with. How do we speak their language, especially when they come from the feminist worldview, which has its own lingo. It has its own lingo. It has its own the arguments and concerns that they're focused on, and so. My presentation today is going to be kind of divided into two sections. The first section, I want to look at the history of feminism, and I want to kind of give you guys a crash course in at least feminism as it pertains to abortion and reproductive technology / reproductive rights. And I want to do that because so often we think about abortion as necessary to be a feminist, as in I've been in classes where they've actually argued that it's impossible to be a pro-life feminist. That's an oxymoron. And that to me is a sign of historical amnesia, because if you know anything about feminism, you know that the early feminists, the women who founded Western feminism as a concept, were very, very pro-life. And there are reasons for that I will get to in a moment. And so they believed that if there was equality between men and women, they couldn't just fight for equality between men and women. They had to fight for equality for human beings generally, born and unborn. And like I said, I'll touch on that in a moment. And so I want to kind of give you guys a crash course on feminism as it pertains to abortion, because what you'll see is that there's actually a lot of common ground, and that we can draw on a lot of feminist rhetoric and a lot of feminist thinking, at least from a traditional first wave feminist perspective to talk about these issues. It was only later on that we started seeing the rise of pro-abortion feminism, and that's kind of become the norm. It's likely what you are most familiar with. It's what I'm most familiar with too. But if we go back to the beginning, we do see that pro-life feminism at least was possible. And so they're not actually diametrically opposed, which is kind of what we're taught in university and what we are led to believe in mainstream society. So I want to do that first, and then after I want to give you guys some practical strategies for how you actually engage with the pro-abortion feminists in your life. One of them will be very academic and high level, and it might be a little dense. So we'll start with that, and then we'll end with kind of more of the conversational approach. Like, how do you use the rhetoric of feminists, not to dive deep into the academic abyss, but just to speak the language of the feminists you're in conversation with, because sometimes that will be the main barrier between you and whoever you're talking to. Is you might actually have a lot in common, but if you don't know the terms that they're comfortable with, or you don't know how to use their terms and actually incorporate them into your pro-life worldview and say, yeah, we actually do agree on this point. Maybe not everything, but on this point. If you don't know how to do that, then that could be the biggest barrier, separate from the arguments. So we'll kind of hit those two practical strategies at that point. So bear with me. Okay, so I want to start off by going through, how do I do this here? There we go. So what is the relationship between feminism and abortion, and is it possible to be a pro-life feminist? That's kind of, those are two of the questions I want to be answering, at least in this section here. And I think that this is important. I'll start off by saying that there are going to be some conversations that you have that are just, that you will not be able to continue. Like, you'll just have to recognize that it's a waste of your time. You're not going to be able to change the other person's mind, and you can agree to disagree. But I think what I want you to be thinking about as you're listening is the ways that you can actually use feminism to build common ground, because we actually have a lot in common from a pro-life perspective with a lot of feminists. It's just how we articulate our position. It's going to be very different from the standard, humanity and personhood arguments that you guys might already be familiar with. Okay, so bear with me. Okay, so feminism and abortion. So just to start off, the women who founded the feminist movement, at least the Western feminist movement as we think about it today, were opposed to abortion. And there were three reasons for this. First of all, they understood that abortion ended a human life. And for that reason, abortion was morally reprehensible. That was pretty clear to them. They really, that is intellectually consistent in light of the fact that they were advocating for the equal value of human life based on gender. Like, if men and women are equal, then why are not all humans equal? That's kind of where they were coming from. And so they saw the idea of opposing abortion as just an extension of what they were already talking about. The other thing, the second point, is they recognized that a lot of abortions were, at least at the time, were being forced on women, or women were being coerced into them because of male partners or because of economic circumstances. And so they said, that women are experiencing these pressures either directly or indirectly. And this is actually impeding women's autonomy, women's agency, and women's ability to be empowered and live an empowered life as equal human beings. And so for those two reasons, they were opposed. And then for the last reason, which I think is huge, and I really love it, it's this idea that early feminists, they believed that women's empowerment shouldn't have to rely on other people giving up their rights. They weren't saying that, men deserved less rights, or that this group of people deserve less rights. They were saying that there should be equal rights. And so if women were a little bit lower in terms of the number of rights they were receiving, that they should be elevated to that standard. And so in order to do that, they recognized that they didn't have to oppress other people, or they shouldn't have to, at least. And there were a lot of problems with feminism. I mean, there are questions about race, and the ways that, conversations about voting and equal pay didn't always include food, racialized communities. It was a lot of the early feminists were upper class white women who could afford to take time off work, for example, to protest. So there's a lot of nuance. I could go into it if you want. But what I can say is that they understood that in order for a woman to be empowered, if we wanted to get to that goal, we shouldn't have to step on other people and oppress other people. And there's actually one feminist, her name is Frances Wright, and she said, whenever we establish our own pretensions upon the sacrifice rights of others, we do in fact impeach our own liberties and lower ourselves in the scale of being. And I love this quote because like that's so true. If you have to get somewhere by hurting and oppressing and discriminating against other people, there's something wrong, and you actually reveal your true nature as an individual, right? You reveal some of the problems with your approach and your worldview. So I really love that. I want to mention a few other famous feminists who were very pro-life, who were all like, these were some of the original feminists. You will likely know about these people because they were so pivotal to the feminist movement. So we can start off with, there we go, Susan B. Anthony. So she campaigned for women's, for equal opportunity and political opportunity. She ran a newspaper that refused to take out ads for companies that made abortifacients, which are just very, very early abortions, like forms of birth control, but they're actually abortifacients. They do not prevent conception, they prevent implantation of the newly formed embryo in the uterine wall. And she argued that abortion was child murder. And so Susan B. Anthony is one example. And she famously wrote, the newspaper reports every day of every year of scandals and outrages, of wife murders and paramour shooting, of abortions and infanticides. They're perpetual reminders of men's incapacity to cope successfully with this monster evil of society. The statutes for marriage and divorce, for adultery, breach of promise, seduction, rape, bigamy, abortion, infanticide, all were made by men. And so her critique was actually that abortion was being used by men to hurt and oppress women, and that it was just another example of the ways that this amorphous patriarchy was kind of oppressing women. So whether you agree with that or not, it's a demonstration of the way that early feminists were thinking about this issue. The next incredible feminist, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, she was the first woman to become a medical doctor in the United States. And she wrote in her journals, she had observed abortion. She wrote that the gross perversion and destruction of motherhood by the abortionist that she had witnessed filled her with indignation. And her sentiments were shared by other early feminist physicians, like Dr. Charlotte Lozier. And so these are physicians, like the first female physicians. These were not radical pro-abortion women, but they were women who understood the horror of abortion and really incorporated that into their feminism. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you might be familiar with her. She was a passionate abolitionist, early suffragette. She worked with Susan B. Anthony. She helped write something called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was this revolutionary document, as pivotal to early feminism. And she wrote this quote I love as well: "When we consider that women are treated as property, it is degrading to women that we should treat our children as property to be disposed of as we see fit." And I love this because it's again, it illustrates how early feminists thought about this issue, which is like, if I'm asking for equality for myself, I cannot premise that on denying equality to someone else, to my unborn child. So I love that. You might be familiar with Alice Paul. She was again a huge early feminist, huge name. She's known around, definitely across North America, maybe around the world. But she famously said abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women. You've likely seen that or heard that before. And so this again just articulates and demonstrates how early feminists thought about this issue. And so these are just 5 of the early feminists, but this is how they thought about the issue. And so what we see right away is that the feminist worldview and pro-life worldview actually went hand in hand. They were not diametrically opposed. And I would say that not only was it possible originally to be a pro-life feminist, but it was kind of expected. It was the norm at the time. Now we know all too well that this shifted over time, and that was really a movement that was started and pivotal to second and third wave feminism. Really started shifting after the sexual revolution. And part of the shift was that there were stats and reports that came out about women losing their lives because of botched abortions. And you'll all be familiar with this. So this argument is still around today. If you want my kind of academic response to it, I can answer that at the end, the back alley abortion question. But what I want to emphasize is that while it's true that there were women who lost their lives tragically in the pursuit of back alley abortions and illegal abortions. While that is true, we do know that a lot of the statistics were largely fictitious and were made up. And we know this because of a man named Dr. Bernard Nathanson. And so he was an abortionist who had a radical change of heart closer to the end of his life and became a huge pro-life activist, argued vehemently against abortion. And one of the things he explained was that the pro-abortion camp actually purposely spread false information, maybe the original fake news, and lied to North America and North American society and the international community in order to further their interests. And so he writes, these are kind of long quotes, but I'll read them out for you guys. So he said, we being him and other pro-abortion people, they fed they fed the public a line of deceit, dishonesty, a fabrication of statistics and figures. We succeeded in breaking down the laws limiting abortions because the time was right and the news media cooperated. We sensationalized the effects of illegal abortions and fabricated polls which indicated that 85% of the public favored unrestricted abortion when we knew it was only 5%. We unashamedly lied, and yet our statements were quoted by the media as though they had been written in law. And so this is one of the two confessions he has. This is another one from a book that he co-wrote called Aborting America. And he says, how many deaths were we talking about when abortion was illegal? In NARAL, the National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws, we generally emphasize the drama of the individual case, not the mass statistics. But when we spoke of the latter, it was always 5,000 to 10,000 a year. I confess that I knew the figures were totally false, but in the quote morality of our revolution, it was a useful figure, widely accepted. So why go out of our way to correct it with an honest statistic? And so this shows the mentality that kind of descended onto the United States, right? And descended into North America. And this is what caused a lot of shift from a pro-life feminist perspective to a pro-abortion feminist perspective. And so I want to just add the caveat that it's clear that there was a compassionate desire, at least from the minds of feminists, they were worried about the health and well-being of women, which is reasonable. And it's something that I want to say, as pro-lifers, we care about too. And so however misguided it was motivated by, I would say largely motivated by this compassionate approach and this desire to help women who were dying. That said, it was based on deceptive statistics, right? And so we can see that this transition from pro-life feminism to a pro-abortion feminist mentality was fueled by deception. And so all that to say, originally the feminist and pro-life worldview, while now they're considered mutually exclusive, it's, like I said, it's considered an oxymoron to call yourself a pro-life feminist. It was not always that way. And so I would say originally the pro-life worldview and the feminist worldview worked hand in hand and really relied on the underlying, like a similar underlying premise, which is that all human life, male and female, born and unborn, is valuable. And so now we see that this transition has occurred, and part of that was because second and third wave feminists were fighting this idea that women were breeders, that women were just valued because they could produce and reproduce. And so they were really fighting that. But on the other hand, and this is where it's interesting, and we kind of get into what we call in feminist an intersectional analysis, where we think not only about gender, but also maybe race and class. While that was happening, second and third wave feminists were talking about being breeders, and they hated that women were considered always in the context, or in their minds, always in the context of their ability to reproduce. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we saw women of color, lower class individuals, disabled individuals who were all being persecuted because they had children and their children were considered undesirable. And so on the opposite end of the spectrum, we had women of color and working class women combating a reverse equation, namely that they were destructive overbreeders whose procreative tendencies needed to be controlled and managed. And so what's interesting is that when feminism, like the feminism we think of now, when they talk about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, they talk about it in the context of abortion, of birth control, that kind of thing. Like it's those are kind of the two big things they're talking about when they talk about reproduction and reproductive freedom and rights. But that did not correspond with the experiences of people of color, women of color, and lower class individuals, disabled individuals, who were not wanting abortion and birth control, but were actually just wanting to be able to have children because they were constantly experiencing regulation and constantly having the state push back against them and their ability to conceive and have children and reproduce. And so the fact that the mentality that won out was the one that suited the upper class white feminists who were not really concerned about the overbreeder argument, but were really just concerned about being able to control their bodies and not have children if they wanted to. That just shows how really originally there was this, sorry, I'll go back. There was the rise of pro-abortion feminism really relied on racism, it relied on classism, and just ignoring the struggles of women who did not fit within the standard rhetoric and worldview that pro-abortion feminists were developing, if that makes sense. And so what we see is that by defining reproductive rights exclusively as related to abortion and birth control, modern day feminists did and have continued to erase, for example, the sterilization abuses that were experienced by women of color and poor women and disabled women. And there are really famous feminist, Audre Lorde, as I want to say she was quoted in every class I took in my undergrad, and she commented that women of color are the primary targets of abortion and sterilization abuses here, being in the United States and abroad. And so women of color and racialized feminists have been speaking out against this and saying, you know, the fact that you define reproductive rights and freedom only in the pursuit of abortion is very privileged because you didn't have to face the struggles that we faced. We also see that there's not conversation about the forced sterilizations and forced abortions that took place in First Nations communities, and that's a huge problem we know here in Canada, where there was so much colonization and so much persecution that happened against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And so what we see is that pro-abortion feminists relied on and was founded on the systemic oppression, discrimination, and elimination of marginalized communities, right? And so all that to say, like, those are the communities they claim to be fighting for, but those are not the communities that benefited from abortion and benefited from birth control the way that they imply. You know what I mean? And so so all that to say, I think what we can say is historically reproductive rights and abortion are connected to racism, ableism, and colonialism. They're still connected to those things, and I'll kind of go into some of these more deeply in a moment, but this legacy continues. We see that racialized communities still make up a disproportionate percentage of abortions. We know that Planned Parenthood clinics in the United States are disproportionately located in racialized communities. We see that disabled children, specifically individuals with Down syndrome, are still targeted through prenatal genetic testing. And I will get to the example of Iceland in a moment. And we see that abortion is now exported to other countries, and we fund abortion internationally. Even in countries where abortion on demand is not accepted and is considered wrong by the communities and by the, you know, whatever people are indigenous to that area. Like in Africa, we still see various countries experiencing abortion pressure, the pressure to accept abortion from groups like Planned Parenthood, Mary Stopes, and the UN, right? And so all of that to say, the rise of pro-abortion feminism and second and third wave feminism is not unproblematic. And so if you really want to get into the conversations, you can go there with that. But all that to say, feminism and support for abortion historically were mutually exclusive. They've become, best friends. They've become something that's really, they're interdependent and intertwined at this point, but historically they were mutually exclusive because abortion and birth control were so deeply rooted in racism, classism, colonialism, and eugenics. And I will get to that in a little bit, but yes. So does that? Hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of a crash course in feminism and the connection between feminism and the pro-life worldview. And I find this personally, really encouraging because, it's hard when you're faced with so few examples of pro-life feminists, when you just see feminism and abortion and you don't want to accept an abortion worldview, but you don't know if you can accept a feminist worldview then because it's so intricately connected to an abortion worldview or a pro-abortion worldview. So I just hope that by teasing those apart and by separating them, that will give you guys something to talk about and consider, and maybe you'll be able to embrace a pro-life feminist worldview if you so choose. So now kind of transitioning over into the strategies and how to approach this strategically, I would encourage you to think about adopting a pro-life feminist perspective. And I say this, and I know some people are really uncomfortable with feminism, and it is super problematic. So, take your time, think about it. But insofar as we are in a world and a society that is really informed by feminism, really informed by identity politics, it's important, if we want to be effective advocates, it's important that we speak their language. It's important that we understand where they're coming from and have effective responses. And so I would really encourage you guys, really think critically about how you can incorporate some of the things I'm about to talk about into your conversations, into your social media posts, into whatever pro-life activism looks like for you. I would also say that feminism and the pro-life worldview are not nearly as diametrically opposed as we've kind of been led to believe. I mean, the reality is that I'm a woman. I love women. I care about women. And one of the main reasons why I am pro-life is because of the stories that I've heard of women who have been forced into abortion, coerced into abortion in Canada. I really believe that women deserve better than abortion, and that our society is failing them by offering them something that is harmful to their bodies and selling them the lie that they need abortion in order to be empowered. Like, there's nothing empowering about being told that the only way you can be successful as a woman is to let someone kill your children. There's nothing empowering about that. And so I would say that there's actually a lot more in common between the feminist and pro-life worldview, even contemporarily. But I will get to that in a moment. So why should we adopt a pro-life feminist worldview? I kind of touched on that a little bit. If you want me to unpack that further, feel free to ask a question about that. So now my strategies. Okay, so there are two strategies I'm going to unpack. The first is very academic and high level, and it's addressing this question. The first question here on the slide: is the way abortion is used moral? So I have been in many conversations with feminists where I just cannot get them to accept the humanity and personhood arguments that are basically like the go-to arguments in pro-life apologetics. I like to think that is the question. If you can establish that it's a human being, I don't know why we have anything further to talk about. Like, human beings deserve human rights. That should be simple. But there are still times that I've been in conversations with people who really cannot get past the morality of abortion as a practice. And so that's when I then say, okay, even if abortion itself as a practice was moral, it's not, but even if it was, are there ways that abortion is being used that are problematic and immoral? And I would say the answer is yes, and I will get to that in a moment. So that's kind of that high level academic response when you're in the middle of a really difficult conversation. The second, more rhetorical approach, just using the language of feminism. The question I'll answer is it possible to be pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life? And this is how I like to introduce myself to people. I will explain why in a moment. But it's this question of, is it possible to draw on a lot of the feminist rhetoric around this issue, but still maintain a pro-life worldview? So I'll get to both. So hang tight. Okay, so you're in a really difficult conversation. Someone is refusing to accept any of your arguments, and you cannot agree that abortion itself is immoral. So this is where I actually developed this presentation. I was in Australia, and I knew that I was speaking to university students who were very hostile. And so I prepared this really high-level academic presentation response to get them to a place where they accepted that even if abortion itself in a neutral, philosophical way, even if they didn't think it was immoral, the way abortion was being used was so problematic that it should still be regulated. That's where I was trying to get them to go. And so I'm gonna kind of walk you through that reasoning and that thinking, so that you can do this on your own, and you can make it as long or short as you want. I will try to keep it brief, but I'll give you the information I have. So I started with the issue of sex selection abortion. Sex selection abortion, I want to say, is usually pretty easy to establish is wrong. So I'll give something of an explanation. Sex selection abortion is where an abortion is performed solely because of the child's sex. While in theory could be used to target male and female children alike, research indicates that it's really being focused on targeting female children. I added, kind of as a little quirk, one of the caveats is that there are third and fourth wave feminists who really are so opposed to the patriarchy that they're committed to not having any male children. I want to say that's the only time I've come across that. So, just know that that's a thing. But really, we see sex selection abortion being used to target systematically female unborn children. And so you're in a conversation with someone, it's usually pretty easy for them to accept that that is wrong. It's not always the case, but this is how I unpack that for them. So typically when you talk about sex selection, people think of China or they think of India. And so what I like to do is explain that, yes, okay, so China does have a lot of sex selection abortion. There are some states, some provinces, whatever they call them. I probably have it written down here. Yeah, provinces. So some provinces where they see 130 male children born for every 100 female children born. And that has shifted from 106 to 101 back in the 1960s and 70s to 130 now. And so we can see that sex selection has really played a pivotal role in China. And part of that is the one-child policy, which I'll touch on a little bit in a moment. In South Korea, even back in 1992, they had 125 male children born for every 100 female children. And in Canada, some of the research we're seeing is that in communities and in certain communities, when a family has had 2 children who are both female, they really start using sex selection at that third pregnancy. Not always, but sometimes they use it earlier, sometimes not. But the research shows that in some communities, like Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese communities, we're seeing 139 male children born for every 100 female children. And then in Indian communities, certain Indian communities, we're seeing 190 male children born for every 100 female children. And so that is concerning. And so it's concerning for a whole lot of reasons, which we'll get to in a moment. But I like to just ask people to stop thinking about this in the context of China and India and South Korea, because that's actually very, very ethnocentric. It's a term that we use in feminism. It's very discriminatory to think that this only happens in other countries, as if Canada doesn't engage in discrimination as well. The reality is that even though approximately 92% of Canadians oppose sex selection abortion, it is permitted in Canada. We've not had any laws saying that you cannot perform sex selection abortion, and we see that it is being practiced. And so I try to really ask people to think about it outside of just an international context and really bring it into the Canadian context. And these are some of the countries that I found research indicating significant sex selection, sex ratio at birth discrepancies, and they're attributing that to sex selection abortion. And so you can see it happens all around the world. So at this point, like I said, it's that you identify this as a problem, and it's usually pretty easy to get whoever you're talking with to accept that sex selection abortion is problematic. Now, I'm going to put a little asterisk on that and say that I've had a lot of conversations with students on campus recently as part of the pro-life club on campus, and the number of students that I've had tell me that, you know, they wouldn't personally abort a child because it's female, but they would be okay with someone else making that decision. I've actually been surprised. And so I thought I would comment on that. Maybe there's some concerns that I have about young people these days. But I would say my response to that is always, well, like what would happen in the context of employment? Let's say I'm working and my employer decides to fire me because I'm female. Would you be comfortable with that? You might not personally do that, but would you be comfortable with someone else doing that? And they always say, heck no. And so that's where I really distinguish for them. Like, you can actually believe whatever you want. You can believe that women are horrible. You can believe that women are less than men. I think you're wrong, but you can believe that. It's when you actually act on that belief that you engage in discrimination, and that's when it's problematic. And so, you know, you go back to a woman, she's pregnant, maybe her family says have a sex selection abortion. We can all look at that belief and say that belief is bad, but whatever, that's your choice. You believe what you want. But the moment the woman or the community engages in a discriminatory practice and has an abortion just because the child is female, that's where you're actually engaging in misogynistic activities. You're actually being discriminatory on the basis of sex. And so that is where you can actually say, okay, you believe whatever you want, you can think whatever you want, but your action is wrong because you've perpetrated discrimination against a community. And so anyway, I just added that asterisk because I was kind of floored at the number of students who seem to really be trying to justify a hyper pro-choice perspective that says, even though I wouldn't do it, you could do it, even in the context of sex selection abortion. But anyway, so then you build common ground, you agree that sex selection abortion is wrong. And then you want to say, okay, well, what are the consequences of sex selection abortion? Sorry, this is a little, so what are the consequences of sex selection abortion? This I added in because it's important to note that sex selection abortion often is done because the husband would like to have the sex selection abortion performed, but I'll get to that in a moment. So when I try to explain the effects of sex selection abortion, I always go to China, and it's not because China, like I'm not trying to target China and persecute them. It's just that because of the one-child policy, the effects are so much more pronounced that we kind of see where our country could be many, many years down the line. It just was escalated, and it was an accelerated descent into chaos and unhealthy, a lot of problems. It was a descent into a lot of problems for China, and because of the one-child policy. But what we see is that it intensified the effects. It didn't necessarily cause them. So I don't think the one-child policy caused all the breakdowns we're about to see, but it just fueled and intensified them, if that makes sense. So the first consequence we see is what I'm writing about here, which is that we see the emergence of forced and coerced abortion. So this author and many writers and researchers have identified that it's typically the husband who would like to have a sex selection abortion. And so what they're often doing is, you know, the woman becomes pregnant and they will force them to go get a sex determination test. And if that test comes back female, they will force the woman to have an abortion. And so we see this happening. We do know that in China, there were actually state-sponsored programs to force women to have abortions. This was something that was talked about. China had to file periodic reports to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And so their report, even back in January 1999, it was already coming to light that they had consistent practices that were including economic sanctions, I should say, and physical violence. All of these were fueling persecution of women and forced abortion. And so what we see is there's forced abortion happening, and there's sex selections, male preference, and that combines so that there is forced sex selection abortion in addition to forced and coerced abortion. And we know this happens not just in China. There's an incredible documentary about sex selection abortion called It's a Girl. And in that documentary, there are women from India who are sharing some of their stories. And one of the women explains that all of the problems she faced started when she became pregnant. They wanted her to get a sex determination test, and they started torturing her to have an abortion done when the test came back with the results of the children would be female. There's another story that was particularly heartbreaking of a woman who I want to say presumably she didn't have access to abortion, and so what she was expected to do is if she gave birth to a female child, she was expected to engage in infanticide and kill that child. And because she continued to conceive female children, she ended up strangling and burying 8 female children, 8 daughters. And so we see that this coercion and this pressure on women to let someone, or engage in the killing themselves, to let someone kill their children because the child is female. We see that pressure come in place when sex selection is permitted to continue unabated. Now, when I tell people about coerced and forced abortion, especially in North America, I see that there's often this response of like, okay, but of course that happens in China and India, it won't happen in Canada. And that bothers me because I know women who have experienced coerced abortion. It is something that happens. And so I would say this idea that it only happens in other countries is quite simply a deluded lie born out of an ignorant and misguided belief in moral superiority. Canada is not shielded. We're not invincible to some of the really problematic and discriminatory and abusive practices we see in other countries. And it's really problematic for us to think that we are. So we have seen research that suggests that in the United States, approximately 64% of post-abortive women felt pressured by others to have abortions. That stat is one that I think a lot more research needs to be done into, but it's definitely something that is happening in North America. And I can share, one of the women I know. I did some activism with her, and she conceived unexpectedly, and it was just a unexpected pregnancy, and it was kind of a crisis pregnancy, but she decided to keep her child. But her family was badgering her to get an abortion all the way up to 7 months, and she thought abortion wasn't allowed after a certain point. And so when she got a call at 7 months from a family member saying, "Don't worry, like we've organized, we can find an abortionist who will do this for you," at 7 months. Like the pressure that she experienced was astronomical. There's another woman I know who she conceived after being sexually assaulted, and when she went to the medical community for support, she had one doctor imply that her child would be a rapist by nature of her conceiving in rape. It's this misguided idea of the rape gene. It's been ruled out. It's completely been debunked, but this doctor implied that her child would go on to sexually assault other people, and encouraged her to have an abortion to prevent that from happening. And then the nurse technician who did her ultrasound told her that she was doing a disservice to society by raising a child as a single mom. And so she experienced so much pressure. Unfortunately, she ended up having a miscarriage, but she had wanted to keep that child, and the amount of pressure she felt to have the abortion was astronomical. I know women who actually ended up going through with the abortion because their boyfriends were forcing them, or their employers were putting pressure on them. And so all that to say, there is coerced abortion that happens in Canada, and it's one of the main reasons why I am personally very pro-life, and why I advocate so much for the pro-life worldview. It's also important to note, it's interesting, Canada does not have explicit restrictions prohibiting coerced abortion. We had a legislative attempt in 2010 that was called Roxanne's Law. It was named after an Indigenous woman who was murdered by her boyfriend because she refused to have an abortion. But it was labeled as being anti-choice or pro-life, and so it was shut down. And so I will walk people through this, because by the time you get to that point, you're kind of like, okay, there is something wrong if in Canada we do not acknowledge that coerced abortion is a crime and that you cannot force a woman to have an abortion. There's something wrong. So backing up, all that to say, when we see that coerced and forced abortion already happens in Canada, and we see that sex selection is happening, the concern is that those two can work together very easily. And I would not be surprised if that's the case. Now, returning to China, when I'm at this point in a conversation, this is when I start unpacking what the consequences are of abortion, of sex selection abortion, what it leads to. And I'll kind of just skim through these really this but the side effects of kind of persistent sex selection abortion. First of all, in China, this is back in 2011, so the number is likely much higher now. But research shows that son preference and sex selective abortion led to 32 million excess men under the age of 20 back in 2011. And so the concern was, these are men who won't be able to marry in a society where marriage is hyper important. Women now, because they'll have more choice, will be able to marry up, and so the men that will be left over, according to research, and at least the concerns of researchers, are that the men who will be left over will be lower income, and what will happen is there'll be this social outcast phenomenon, and so there's evidence that indicates that the majority of violent crime is perpetrated by young, unmarried, low-income males, low status males, I should say. And so there's a lot of concern, because there are all these unmarried men in China who are going to be experiencing a lot of social pressure because they're not able to get married now. And we see that between China, India, and some of the surrounding countries like Pakistan, we see that there's going to be, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, there are going to be a lot of men who are going to struggle because they won't necessarily be able to get married because of the gender imbalance. And we're already seeing, research indicates that there are higher levels of depression, lower levels of self-esteem, higher rates of, or that these men are more prone to aggression. And that's kind of some of the concerns that are happening. There's also some serious concerns, this is the one that I really get stuck on, about what it means for there to be all these unmarried men who want to get married, what that means for illegal bride selling, and what this means for human trafficking. And there's evidence that indicates that these illegal trades have been increasing in China. And so all this to say, correlation does not equal causation, and so I'm not implying that there aren't other factors contributing to this, but what I am saying is that the effects of sex selection are a lot more than just these societal concerns about what it means in terms of misogyny and discrimination and sexism. There are also some really serious concerns about sexual assault rates increasing, sex work, sex trafficking increasing, that kind of thing. So then I get to this point in the conversation and I say, okay, why is this happening? Why do we see this happening? Well, first of all, there's misogyny. First of all, there's sexism. Like, this is not a new phenomenon. But second of all, we see that in Canada, there are no laws on abortion. And so our laws actually permit sex selection and help foster it. There's one researcher, Professor Edlund, and she's the associate professor of economics at Columbia University, and she talks about how there's like this perfect storm. There's a variety of factors, including affordability and the ease of access of abortion, as well as Canada's deeply rooted respect for diversity, all of these things really enable sex selection to take on a life of its own, and kind of create the perfect storm. Like I said, Canada has no laws on abortion, and even efforts to regulate sex selection abortion historically have been shut down, although there's an incredible piece of legislation right now that was tabled by Member of Parliament Kathy Wagenthal, that's trying to regulate and condemn sex selection abortion. So write to your Member of Parliament and asking them to support that. I suspect that will kind of be something that's looked at after the coronavirus concerns have abated, but we see that there's this perfect storm in Canada because we have no laws. And what's interesting is that in the quest to foster choice and in the quest to foster bodily autonomy and women's rights, which is why Canada has no laws, or why we continue to have no laws, the fact that we have no laws is actually leading to more discrimination and sexism and misogyny. And so it's ironic and really problematic and concerning. And if you point that out to someone, it causes them to think. It's also interesting, this is kind of as a side note, but it's interesting because one researcher has noted that prospective parents who are selecting embryos for in vitro fertilization are not permitted, they're absolutely prohibited from choosing on the basis of gender. And yet it is perfectly legal for parents to choose to destroy a 19-week-old fetus simply because she is female. And so you can see that there's a double standard. And so when you're in conversations, when you point that out, that is really powerful. So then what I ask people to think of, and I know that this is getting lengthy, but like this is what you kind of have to do. You zoom out a little bit. And then I ask people to think about why is sex selection happening? So there's misogyny and sexism, there's the lack of laws in Canada, but ultimately, sex selection abortion is a manifestation of a mentality that's been around for a long time, and this is the eugenics mentality. And so the eugenics mentality has played a really interesting role in the rise of abortion because of a woman named Margaret Sanger. You might be familiar with her. She really advocated in favor of birth control, population control, and eugenics. She wrote this, which is super interesting. She said, birth control is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit, of preventing the birth of defectives or of those who will become defectives. So this is Margaret Sanger for you. It was written about her that her explicit aims in bringing birth control to India, for example, were to bring the poorer and biologically worse endowed stocks the knowledge of birth control that was known among those who are genetically and economically better favored. And so you can hear the eugenics in her writing and the way that she thought. I'm just to give you Leah, is that my signal to?
Hey, so I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, Leah. I know a couple people have started to leave. We're just about at 9 o'clock, so I think Leah could probably go on for another hour. So I think what I could do here, Leah, how much time do you think you have left?
I can cut it short. I can keep it to another 5 minutes if you need.
Okay, so what we'll do is, Leah, I don't know if you want to come back tomorrow. Are you able to come back for the panel tomorrow afternoon?
Yep.
Okay, so Leah will be back. So we will skip our question time with her and save it for the panel. And I just want to say, I'll do a little bit of like a wrap up right now and then let Leah finish her 5 minute. If you need to go, folks, we understand. It is getting late, but we appreciate you being here. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Click on the link in your invitation, and we'll resume here again tomorrow. And Leah has a lot of great content, so please stick around and hear her out. And if you leave, thank you for coming, and we hope you tune in again tomorrow. Okay, go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, I'll keep it short. So basically what I would do is I would back out and I would say, so you look at eugenics and you look at the role that eugenics has played in the rise of the abortion of abortion and of birth control. You look at Margaret Sanger and her involvement, and what you see is that there's this eugenics mentality that has supported abortion. And at that point, the reason I say sex selection is caused by eugenics and not just sexism is because we see ableism. We see the discrimination against individuals who have Down syndrome. And for those who are familiar with it, you'll know that Iceland recently announced that they cured Down syndrome, and that's simply because they abort 100% of people who are of children who are diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb. And so when you paint this picture for someone and you're in a conversation with them and you paint this picture about how there's sex selection and that is happening as well as discrimination on the basis of ability, and you show that there's eugenics, the conclusion you force the other individual to come to, they kind of have two options. They either have to accept that they're willing to support all of those things, or they have to accept that there are situations where the use of abortion is problematic, where abortion is being used to systematically target and discriminate against certain individuals. And so that is how I approach those difficult conversations, because when you force people to look at what abortion is doing on a grand scale, you force them to look beyond the individual and look at what abortion does on mass, the ways that it's being used to target women, to target disabled individuals. You force them to accept that regulations must be put in place. So, sorry, give me a So the last thing that I'll end with is like I said, why I say that I am pro-woman, pro-choice, pro-life. So I've kind of already talked about some of the issues around choice, but I like to use this rhetoric because I find that when I just say to pro-abortion feminists that I'm pro-life, they immediately shut down, and it prevents them from connecting with me. It prevents me from being able to say anything. And so I always say that I'm pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life, and that confuses them just long enough that I'm able to share some of my reasoning. So just the Coles Notes version is I say that I'm pro-choice, not in the context that we usually think about it, but I say that I'm pro-choice because the reality is that I'm a woman. I support choice as a concept, but I also recognize that choices come with responsibilities and restrictions, and my right to do what I want with my body does not justify anything. My right to do what I want with my body ends where the rights of another individual begin. But that does not mean that I don't support choice. And so I'm able to say that I support choice and that I'm pro-women choosing, but then just kind of give the opportunity, you build that common ground, and then ask people to think about what it means to choose what to do with someone else's body, which is what abortion does. I also will often bring up the stories of women I know who've had abortions and been forced into abortions, and I then present that to them and say, you think that this is all about choice, but there are women in Canada who are being forced to have abortions against their will, and your push for abortion on demand makes it more difficult for them to receive the support they need. And so you really need to be thinking about the ways that in the name of choice, women are actually losing true choice. They're losing the ability to make choices because of this radical pro-abortion, abortion on demand mentality. So that's how I approach the pro-choice, pro-life side of things, and that's why I use the term pro-choice. So don't freak out. I am 100% pro-life, but I do like to use their terms because we are actually supportive of choice. We recognize that some choices are bad, and that being anti-choice in that context is not bad. Just like being, anti-theft is not bad. Like, that is not a good choice. So you just ask people to nuance that a little bit. And then I think it's pretty obvious why we as pro-lifers can say that we're pro-woman. There's the issue of sex selection abortion. There's the reality that a lot of us are women. You've heard from some other incredible women today, and you'll hear from some other incredible pro-life women tomorrow. But I ask people to think about something that I call the cure-all abortion theory. And the long and short is, if there's a 16-year-old girl who's homeless, she's in an abusive relationship, and she's unexpectedly pregnant, society looks at her and looks looks at her and says, don't worry, we got you, we'll give you an abortion. Setting aside the fact that that is harmful to her and that is immoral, she is still homeless and she's still in an abusive relationship. So have we actually empowered her? Can we actually say that we were looking out for her best interests? No, because the reality is that abortion does not end abuse, it does not end poverty, it does not end terminal health issues. And so when we sell it to women as though it solves all those problems, as though it's a cure-all, we actually do women a disservice and we prevent them from experiencing the empowerment that we claim to be giving them. And so that's why I say that I'm pro-woman, because I believe that women deserve better than abortion. And if it's 2020, we should be able to offer women in crisis pregnancies something better than abortion. And the reality is that it's the crisis that needs to end in a crisis pregnancy situation, not the life of the unborn child. And the woman should not have to bear the burden and the harm that comes with having an abortion. And so wrapping it up, when you're thinking of having conversations with pro-abortion feminists, that is language that I would encourage you to consider using. And you can make it your own, but don't be afraid to say that you are pro-woman or pro-choice and pro-life, that those can coexist. Don't be afraid to combat those anti-woman, anti-choice stereotypes. Don't let them silence you with those. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much done. At this point, I think we're way past time. 5 minutes and question period. So I'm content to stay on and field questions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you guys for listening. If you have questions, you can reach out to me over my website, or you could come back tomorrow. So hopefully I'll see you all there.
Yes, please come back tomorrow. And thank you so much, Leah. You are filled with so many good things to share with us. Some mental exercise there, but also a lot of key things that we try to talk about at Halton Alive, looking at language and really trying to assess what's kind of in behind the ideas of abortion and kind of just getting to the root of things. And I think if we do some of these mental exercises, we're going to be way more prepared when we talk to people in more casual conversations, because we've done the work of thinking it through ourselves. So thank you so much for helping us through with that process. That is awesome. We will, you know what, I'm going to save some of the questions. Please still send us your questions, folks, but I'm going to save some of these questions for our panel tomorrow, if that's okay, because I think they're going to be good, and we are just past 9 o'clock. I want to do a quick random, Benedict McCreesh was not here, so I'm going to do another draw real quick and see if we can get someone in the room who was winning this mug. So I get another draw here for, is Catherine McGlade in? Catherine McGlade? No? All right, I'll do one more, and if we can't find somebody to win this, we will just do it tomorrow. One more, number 34 here. Nicole Schwantz in the room. We'll see if she's in the room as well. Oh, she is. I see her. Okay, so Nicole, you are the winner. That's great. So you'll get this lovely Choose Life mug. Connect with us. We probably already have your address, but we'll figure all that out later. Thank you all for coming. There will be more door prizes tomorrow and more great content. We will have our workshop people tomorrow. So that's Sam, Dr. Miller, and Tabitha. And you can check out their topics and profiles on our website, haltonalive.ca/lifetalks. Thank you for being here. I had fun. It was great to talk with you all. And Leah, we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom.
Thank you for your patience with me.
Awesome. Okay, folks, so we will end this session and see you all tomorrow at 10 a.m. Have a good sleep.